The maitre d' laughed when he saw the man in work boots walk in with his daughter. But when the little girl whispered, "Daddy, this is the place Mom dreamed of," the laughter stopped, especially when he opened his wallet and revealed what was inside. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Snow drifted like slow-moving confetti through the Manhattan night, falling in soft spirals beneath the glow of street lamps. The city had already tucked itself into its winter rhythm, rushing taxis, steaming vents, and people walking fast enough to outrun the cold. But on the corner of Lexington and 54th, time seemed to slow. A little girl stood at a restaurant window, her mitten pressed flat against the glass, fog blooming around her breath. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the snow. "It's even prettier than I imagined." Inside, Levantier glowed like another world entirely. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables dressed in linen so white it looked untouched by hands. Waiters glided between seats like they were choreographed, balancing plates painted with food so perfect it looked like art. Soft strings filled the room, live violinists playing something delicate and French. Every sound, every flicker of light, every gleam of silver seemed to say one thing: you don't belong here unless you've earned it. Beside the window stood Sam Carter. He was 37, a construction foreman who wore his years the way some men wore medals: etched lines, rough palms, tired eyes. His boots were still dusted with gray concrete from his shift, his jacket faded from 100 winters. He looked like a man who worked hard enough to keep standing, but not quite hard enough to stand anywhere like this. He watched his daughter's reflection in the glass instead of the glittering room inside. Her eyes, wide, brown, and too old for 8 years, were full of the kind of wonder he hadn't seen since before her mother died. "This was Mom's favorite place," she said, her breath painting tiny clouds on the window. "You promised we'd come someday." Sam's throat tightened. He remembered the promise well, made years ago in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fading hope. His wife, Marianne, had seen a photo of Levantier in a magazine and smiled weakly. "Someday when I'm better, we'll go there. Just us three. You, me, and Ella." She never got better. And "someday" had become one of those words that haunted him. Too late, too far, too expensive. But tonight, with his overtime pay cashed and his daughter wearing the little blue dress Marianne had bought before she passed, Sam had decided someday was now. Even if it meant scraping the last of his savings. Even if it meant walking into a place built for people who never had to count tips or hours. He knelt down beside Ella, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her eyes. "You ready, sweetheart?" She nodded, smiling shyly. "Do you think they'll let us in?" Her question hit harder than she knew. "Of course they will," he said gently. "We have a reservation. Remember? I called days ago." She grinned. "Then let's go make Mommy proud." For a moment, standing there in the swirl of snow and city light, Sam let himself believe it would be simple. Just a dinner, just a promise kept. He took her small hand in his calloused one and pushed open the door. Warmth greeted them immediately, the scent of butter, wine, and candle wax. The room fell into a quiet rhythm of eyes glancing up, curiosity prickling the air. The sound of his boots against marble felt louder than it should have. A hostess approached, her black dress sleek, her smile professional but faltering as she took in his jacket, his boots, his daughter's second-hand coat. She didn't need to say it. He could already feel the unspoken judgment in the way she hesitated before asking, "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Sam replied calmly. "Carter?" 6:30. She checked her tablet, brow furrowing like she'd expected not to find it, but there it was. "Right," she said, forcing the smile back. "Please wait a moment." As she walked away, a couple nearby leaned toward each other, whispering something behind half-covered smiles. Sam pretended not to notice, but Ella saw. Her hand squeezed his tighter. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Are we dressed okay?" He looked down at her, the neat braid she'd done herself, the scuffed patent shoes she'd insisted on polishing. "You look perfect," he said, meaning it. Through the kitchen doors, the faint sound of laughter drifted out, staff chuckling about something that didn't reach this part of the room. Sam stood quietly, waiting. He was used to waiting. When he looked up again, his eyes found the chandelier, thousands of glass prisms bending light into rainbows. He imagined Mary Ann here, the way she would have tilted her head, the way she would have laughed softly at how nervous he looked. "Do you think Mom would like it?" Ella asked. He smiled. "She'd love it." A pause, then softer. "Do you think she can see us?" Sam exhaled. The truth caught in his chest, fragile and heavy. "Yeah," he said. "I think she's right here with us." Ella's eyes shimmered with something between sadness and belief. She nodded, holding her tiny purse close, as if her mother's memory were tucked inside it. A waiter brushed past, the scent of rosemary and wine trailing behind. The world moved around them, swift, polished, expensive. But for Sam and Ella, time had slowed again. Through the reflection in the glass, he saw himself as the room saw him, the wrong kind of man in the wrong kind of place. But when he looked down at Ella, none of that mattered. She wasn't seeing the marble or the chandeliers. She was seeing a promise kept, and though he didn't know it yet, before the night was over, he wouldn't just be keeping a promise. He'd be rewriting what this place and the people in it believed about worth. As the hostess finally returned and gestured toward their table, Sam took one last look through the window they had stood behind only minutes ago. Snow was still falling outside, soft and steady, painting the city in white. He thought of Marian's handwriting on that old napkin still folded in his jacket pocket. "Dinner at Levantier someday." He smiled faintly. "Come on, kiddo," he said. "Let's go finish what we started." And as they stepped into the golden light of the restaurant, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, unaware that something extraordinary had just walked in, not money, not power, not status, just love that refused to be told it didn't belong. The door swung open, and warmth rushed over them like a sigh. Soft piano music, the low hum of conversation, and the rich scent of butter and truffle. For one fragile heartbeat, Sam felt something close to peace, the kind that had been missing from his life for years, the kind that made him think, maybe this night can still be what she dreamed it could be. Then the voice came, sharp, clipped, coated with politeness like sugar over poison. "Sir," said a woman from behind a polished podium, "this establishment has a dress code." Sam turned. The woman's posture was perfect, every hair in place, her black suit pressed to perfection. Her name tag read, Madeline Rivers, Manager. Her eyes, however, were the real introduction. They flicked over his scuffed boots, his faded jacket, the way a jeweler might inspect a counterfeit. Ella's small hand slipped into his. He could feel her squeeze, uncertain but trusting. "I made a reservation," Sam said evenly, "under Carter." Madeline blinked as though the name itself offended her. She tapped her tablet with long manicured fingers. "Yes, I see it," she said finally. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "But I think there's been a mistake." She let the pause linger, her gaze drifting pointedly to Ella. "This restaurant isn't exactly Muslim family-friendly." The words landed like a slap disguised as etiquette. Conversations nearby slowed, the kind of hush that happens when people smell tension but don't want to be seen watching. A waiter glanced their way, then quickly looked down, pretending to straighten his tray. Sam didn't move. He'd been talked down to before, foremen, executives, the kind of people who measured worth by the price of their wristwatch, but never in front of his daughter. That was different. Ella tugged gently at his sleeve. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered. "We can go somewhere else." He looked at her then, really looked, her little blue dress, the one her mother had bought before she passed, her eyes bright but already dimming under the weight of someone else's judgment. He took a slow breath. His voice came out quiet, steady. "No," he said. "Your mom dreamed of this place. Tonight we eat here." Madeline's brows lifted, amused. "We'll see about that." She turned, signaling a waiter. "Please escort our guest to the waiting area. I'll see what I can do." Her words dripped civility, but her tone carved deep. Sam nodded once, jaw tight. "We'll wait." The waiter, a young man with kind eyes, motioned toward a velvet bench near the entrance. Sam guided Ella there. She sat, swinging her legs, pretending not to notice the stares. Behind the podium, Madeline leaned toward another hostess. "Honestly," she murmured, just loud enough for the words to carry, "he's wearing work boots." A quiet laugh followed, delicate and cruel. Sam's ears caught every syllable, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that dignity doesn't always shout. It endures. He kept his hand around Ella's, feeling her pulse, fast and nervous, beneath his thumb. "Daddy," she whispered after a long silence, "do they think we don't belong here?" He turned to her, forcing a smile that hurt more than any insult. "Sweetheart, belonging isn't something people can give you. It's something you decide for yourself." Across the room, champagne glasses clinked. A violinist began to play something delicate and distant. The night moved on without them, but Sam stayed still, anchored in that one promise he'd made long ago, to give his daughter the memory her mother never got to have. Madeline returned eventually, her smile tight enough to crack. "You're in luck," she said. "A small table opened up, near the kitchen, I'm afraid." "I hope that's acceptable." Sam nodded. "It's perfect." As he rose and took Ella's hand, Madeline stepped aside, but as they passed, she whispered under her breath, "Try not to scuff the floors." Sam stopped, just for a moment. Then he looked at her, really looked, and said quietly, "Ma'am, I've spent most of my life cleaning floors. I promise you, I know how to respect one." Her expression faltered, but he didn't wait for a reply. He walked on, shoulders squared, his daughter beside him, the two of them crossing from the cold into the warmth of a room that had no idea what grace truly looked like. And though Madeline couldn't see it yet, that night, the man she sneered at was about to change everything she thought she knew about worth. They stood in the corner like a shadow that didn't belong to the light. The foyer of Levantier shimmered with motion, couples gliding past in silk and cologne, waiters weaving through the glow of chandeliers, glasses chiming like the laughter of people who had never known hunger or heartbreak. Sam felt it before anyone said a word, the shift in air when people notice you and wish you weren't there. He'd felt it in boardrooms, in job interviews, in PTA meetings where every other parent wore confidence like a tailored coat. But it hit harder now, with his daughter at his side. Ella fidgeted with the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one her mother had given her years ago. Tiny hearts etched along the band, slightly tarnished now, but full of memory. She traced it with her thumb, eyes darting nervously between the waiters and the guests. "Do people think we're lost?" she asked in a whisper, meant only for him. Sam looked down at her. He forced a smile, one that tugged at the corner of his mouth but never reached his eyes. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "They just forgot what kindness looks like." Her eyes lingered on the tables near the front, the ones glowing under golden light, where laughter sounded easy, where plates arrived like promises. Sam could tell she was trying to imagine her mother sitting there, chin resting on her hand, smiling at them both. He wished he could imagine it too. Madeline returned, her heels clicking with practiced authority. The clipboard in her hand might as well have been a shield. "Mr. Carter," she said, the false sweetness in her tone grating like glass. "You're in luck. We might have a small table available, near the kitchen." The pause before near the kitchen was deliberate, her eyes flicking between his boots and jacket, as though to remind him how out of place they were. Sam felt the sting, but didn't show it. He just nodded once. "That's fine," he said. "Follow me." As they walked through the restaurant, the marble floor seemed to echo louder beneath his boots. People's eyes followed them, some curious, others quietly amused. Two men at a corner table leaned toward each other, whispering behind their napkins. "Must have walked into the wrong place," one of them murmured. Sam heard it. He always did. He didn't flinch, but Ella's small shoulders folded inward like she wanted to disappear. He tightened his grip on her hand, not in anger, but to steady her. "Chin up, kiddo," he said softly. "We belong anywhere love takes us." Madeline didn't look back. Her perfume trailed in her wake, something sharp and expensive that clung to the air. She led them past tables adorned with crystal glasses and white orchids, past guests who paused mid-conversation to glance their way. When they reached the back of the room, the lights dimmed to a duller glow. The music was still playing, but back here it sounded muffled, blurred by the sound of the kitchen door swinging open every few seconds. Behind it came the crash of dishes, the bark of orders, the metallic hiss of steam. "Here we are," Madeline said, gesturing to a small table tucked against the wall. "I hope this will do." Sam smiled politely. "It's perfect," he said. Madeline hesitated, perhaps expecting irritation, maybe even apology. But he gave her neither. That unnerved her more than anger would have. She turned briskly and disappeared into the glow of the front dining room. Ella climbed onto her chair quietly. The tablecloth was clean but wrinkled, the candle unlit. She looked up at her father. "It's kinda loud," she said. "Yeah," Sam said, unfolding his napkin. "Guess that means the food's fresh." That made her smile just a little. He sat there for a moment, watching her pick at the edges of her menu, and something inside him twisted. He'd been here before, not in a restaurant like this, but in the same kind of moment, where pride cost more than money, where staying seated meant swallowing every ounce of humiliation for the sake of something bigger. He looked at Ella, her trust, her hope, the way she still believed in promises, and knew why he was here. Not for the food, not even for Marianne's dream, but to show his daughter that dignity didn't depend on chandeliers or polished floors. From somewhere deep in the kitchen, a waiter shouted an order. A plate crashed. The air trembled with noise. But at their small table by the swinging doors, Sam Carter sat a little taller, his hand resting gently over his daughter's. He had walked through 100 kinds of fire in his life. This one would not burn him. The young waiter approached with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His name tag read Julian, and though he stood straight, his tone wavered somewhere between formality and discomfort. "Can I get you something to start?" he asked, his words careful, as if afraid of stepping wrong in front of his manager. Sam looked up from the menu, meeting the boy's uncertain gaze. "2 small plates," he said, his voice steady. "The soup and the risotto." He knew exactly what he was ordering, not because he wanted them, but because he could afford them. Barely. Julian nodded quickly, writing it down. "Of course, sir." Ella's wide eyes danced over the menu like it was a map of some foreign world. "Everything looks so fancy," she said, barely above a whisper. "They even have food I can't pronounce." Sam smiled softly. That same quiet patience that had carried him through years of nights just like this one. "Pick anything, kiddo. Tonight's for you." She grinned, a tooth slightly crooked, the way her mother's used to be. "Then I'll just have what you're having," she said, folding the menu neatly. "It feels like Mom's favorite kind of night." When Julian disappeared into the kitchen, Sam leaned back, exhaling slow. The low hum of the restaurant surrounded them, forks on china, the clink of wine glasses, murmurs of wealth disguised as small talk. It was a different kind of noise than the one he was used to. Not the roar of machinery or the chatter of construction crews, but something sharper, thinner. A room full of people trying to sound important. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. It was worn, soft at the edges, creased from years of being carried, forgotten, then remembered again. He unfolded it carefully, the ink faded to a pale gray. Dinner at Levantier someday. Just us and Ella. The handwriting curved with a familiar grace, his wife's. Marianne had written it on an ordinary afternoon years ago, while scribbling grocery lists and doodling hearts beside his name. She'd smiled when she wrote it, like it was a dream she believed he could somehow give her. He hadn't. Not while she was alive. Bills had stacked higher than dreams. Hospital visits, rent. Life had demanded its price. And by the time he'd saved enough to take her anywhere, she was gone. Now, this napkin was all that remained of that promise. A fragile piece of paper that had somehow outlived the woman who wrote it. Ella noticed him staring at it. "What's that?" she asked, leaning over the table. He hesitated, then turned it toward her. "It's something your mom wrote," he said softly. Her eyes traced the faded words. "She wanted to come here too?" "She did," Sam said, his voice barely steady. "I found this when I was cleaning the old apartment. Thought maybe she'd like knowing we made it." Ella pulled a crayon from her tiny purse, a habit she'd never dropped, and began drawing tiny hearts around the words, like she was decorating a shrine. "Do you think Mom can see us?" she asked. Sam swallowed hard. The ache came suddenly, sharp and tender. "Yeah," he said, managing a small smile. "I think she's right here, sweetheart." For a moment neither spoke. The candle between them flickered gently, its reflection trembling in Ella's eyes. It was one of those rare silences that didn't need filling, just living in. From across the room, Madeline Rivers stood by the host stand, arms crossed, gaze locked on their table. Her lips pinched in disapproval. To her, it wasn't grief unfolding before her, it was optics. A man in work boots and a child in hand-me-downs disrupting the uniform elegance of her dining room. "This isn't good for our image," she muttered to another waiter passing by. "Make sure they're not here too long." The waiter hesitated, uncomfortable. "They're not causing any trouble, Ms. Rivers." Her eyes narrowed. "Not yet," she said, voice low. Back at the table, Sam folded the napkin again, tucking it gently back into his jacket. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a bridge. Between then and now. Between the promise and its quiet fulfillment. He reached across the table, brushing a crumb from Ella's sleeve. "You know," he said, "your mom used to laugh when she couldn't pronounce fancy French words either. She'd just point and say, that one, the one that sounds expensive." Ella giggled. "Then we should do that too." "Deal," Sam said, smiling for real this time. Somewhere in the corner, the violinist began a new song, slow, sweet, and haunting. Sam leaned back, closing his eyes for just a second. For the first time in years, the ache inside him didn't feel like loss. It felt like remembering. And for that small, impossible moment, it was enough. The plates arrived with a quiet clatter. Silver lids lifted in perfect choreography. Steam curled through the air, carrying the smell of truffle and butter. Something rich enough to make Ella's eyes widen. For a moment, everything felt still, almost normal. She leaned over the table, her excitement soft but contagious. "It's so fancy," she whispered, watching the soup shimmer under the light. "It looks like art." Sam smiled faintly. "Then let's enjoy the masterpiece," he said, trying to sound easy, unbothered. But he could feel it, the way the air in the room seemed to shift when people noticed them. The glances weren't curious anymore. They were calculated, cruel in small ways. You could always tell when people had decided you didn't belong. At the next table sat 3 young men in sleek suits, laughing too loudly, their watches catching the light like badges of belonging. Their words carried just enough to cut. "Did we start letting construction workers in?" one of them said, loud enough to reach every nearby table. The others chuckled, sharp and mean. Sam froze for just a second. He'd been in firefights, held dying friends in his arms, worked 18-hour shifts to keep food on the table. But somehow, this moment, this quiet ridicule in front of his daughter, hit deeper than any wound he'd ever taken. It wasn't pain that flared through him. It was something older, shame. He didn't turn, didn't react, just reached for his spoon, his hand steady. "Eat up, kiddo," he said gently. Ella blinked, confused. Why are they laughing? He looked at her, the innocence in her face, the way she asked without fear of the answer. He swallowed hard. "Because they don't know any better," he said softly. "Sometimes people laugh when they don't understand what they're looking at." Her brow furrowed. "Like when kids laugh at someone different?" "Exactly," he said. "Except these are just older kids in nicer shoes." She giggled, but her eyes didn't sparkle the same way. She could feel it too, the coldness beneath the chandelier light. That's when Madeline appeared again, the click of her heels slicing through the murmur of the room. Her smile was poised, perfect, and utterly false. "Sir," she began, her voice low but carrying, "perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a different establishment. We have an image to maintain." The words dropped like stones into still water. The nearby tables went quiet. One of the executives smirked, swirling his wine like he was watching theater. Sam lifted his gaze to her slowly. For a long second he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was calm. Too calm. "My reservation," he said, each word deliberate. "My table, my bill. That's all I need." Madeline blinked, taken aback for the briefest moment, then regained her composure. "Suit yourself," she said lightly. "But you might find this place out of your price range." That did it. The air seemed to thicken. Sam didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Years of being underestimated had taught him that quiet could be louder than shouting. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes steady, unshaken. "Then you should probably check the price of decency," he said, "because it looks like you've run out." Madeline's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels echoing too loudly against the marble. Across the table, Ella's hand gripped his sleeve, small and trembling. "Daddy," she whispered, "maybe we should go." Sam turned to her. The tension in his chest eased when he saw her eyes, wide and uncertain, searching his face for guidance. He forced a smile, not out of defiance, but something gentler, truer. "No, honey," he said quietly. "Sometimes you stay. Not because you can afford it." He reached over, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "But because you earned it." She nodded slowly, her hand relaxing in his. The waiter returned, eyes darting between them and the table of executives. "Everything all right here?" he asked carefully. Sam smiled up at him. "Perfect," he said. "Just perfect." The laughter from the next table faded into silence. Even the violin seemed to soften its tune, as if the room itself had grown aware of its own cruelty. Sam lifted his spoon again and took a slow bite of the soup. It was rich, balanced, elegant, and yet it tasted of something far better than any meal could offer. It tasted like standing your ground. The night had begun to soften around the edges, the way it does when exhaustion and warmth start to blur into something fragile. The clinking of glasses, the quiet hum of conversation, the faint scrape of forks against porcelain, all of it blended into a low rhythmic backdrop that felt almost musical. Sam sat a little straighter now, though the weight of the evening clung to him like a coat he couldn't take off. Across from him, Ella toyed with her fork, pushing tiny bites of risotto into the shape of a heart. The candle between them flickered, and for a fleeting moment she looked so much like her mother that it stole his breath. The soft concentration, the gentle curve of her smile. It was Mary Ann, right there in front of him, small and alive in their daughter's face. Memory crept in without asking. He could almost hear the laughter from years ago, the kind that used to fill their kitchen when the world was simpler. Mary Ann flipping pancakes, her hair pulled back messily, a streak of flour on her cheek. "One day," she'd said, holding up a burnt pancake like it was gold, "we'll eat at a real fancy place, with napkins that match and everything." He'd laughed, leaning on the counter. "You mean some place with real napkins?" She'd tossed the pancake at him, both of them laughing until Ella, barely 3 at the time, had joined in without knowing why. Now, years later, the memory pressed against his ribs, sharp with irony. The napkins here were folded with military precision, the table shimmered beneath perfect light, and she wasn't here to see any of it. Ella took another small bite, chewing thoughtfully before whispering, "It tastes good, just not the same as when you cook." Sam smiled faintly, setting down his fork. "That's because theirs has price tags," he said softly. "Mine has love." A few tables away, a young server carrying a tray overheard him. He glanced over, and for a split second their eyes met. The server's mouth quirked into a small, genuine smile. Not pity, not mockery, just quiet respect. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but Sam felt it. The kind of human acknowledgement that money couldn't buy or status couldn't command. Across the room, however, Madeline Rivers saw it too, and it soured her immediately. She stood at her post near the bar, her reflection catching in the polished glass behind her. That simple moment of kindness unsettled her. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Sympathy wasn't part of the image she curated so carefully for Levantier. She leaned toward Julian as he passed, lowering her voice. "Make sure their bill reflects every cent," she said coldly. "No exceptions." Julian paused, his pen hovering above his notepad. "Ma'am, he's just—" "I said no exceptions," she snapped. The words cracked like ice. Julian nodded quietly and walked away, his shoulders tense. Back at the table, Sam didn't know any of this. He only knew the ache in his chest and the way his daughter's laughter, faint but real, could still cut through the noise. He poured her water from the small crystal carafe and watched the reflection shimmer in her glass. "You know," he said, "your mom would have ordered dessert first." Ella giggled. "She said it was the most important part of dinner." "She was right," he murmured. "She usually was." The violinist in the corner shifted into a slower tune, a haunting, lilting melody that clung to the air like memory itself. It was beautiful and sad all at once, the kind of music that made people stop talking without realizing why. Even the servers moved differently, quieter, as though the song demanded reverence. Sam looked at his daughter again and thought about how fragile joy could be, how it existed only in moments like this, small enough to fit in a child's laugh, delicate enough to vanish with a sigh. He felt Marianne everywhere now, not as a ghost that haunted, but as gratitude that refused to leave. And though no one in the room could see it, there was something sacred happening at that small table near the kitchen. A man quietly honoring love in the one place that had tried to strip him of dignity. When the final note from the violin drifted into silence, Sam reached across the table and brushed his thumb gently over the back of Ella's hand. "You okay, sweetheart?" She nodded, smiling softly. "Yeah," she said. "I think Mom would have liked it here." He smiled, too. A quiet, aching thing. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think she'd like that we came anyway." And for the first time that night, the heaviness didn't feel so heavy. It felt like remembrance. It felt like love, finding its way home. The sound of breaking glass came first, a sharp, accidental crack that sliced through the music and laughter. Then came the spill. A full glass of red wine, tumbling in slow motion, arcing like a cruel comet before landing squarely across Ella's white dress. The deep crimson spread fast, blooming like a wound against soft cotton. Ella gasped, her small hands frozen midair, her eyes wide with shock. For a second she didn't move. Then the trembling began. Her lip quivered as she looked down at herself, the stain already seeping through the fabric like it had been waiting for its moment to ruin her night. The young busboy who'd caused it, barely out of high school by the look of him, stood there, pale and horrified. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," he stammered, grabbing for a towel that wasn't there. His voice shook. I didn't mean, Before Sam could even speak, Madeline Rivers descended like a storm in heels. She appeared from across the room with terrifying precision, her presence commanding the kind of silence that came from fear, not respect. Her expression was ice, controlled, cutting, cold, Out, she said flatly, her tone slicing through the boy's panic. This is unacceptable. The busboy froze. Ma'am, it was an accident. I said out, she snapped, her voice louder this time. Heads turned, conversation stopped. We cannot have scenes like this disturbing our clientele. Sam rose slowly from his seat. It was an accident, he said evenly. She's just a child. Madeline folded her arms, eyes narrowing at the sight of his work-worn jacket, the way the red stain now clung to the little girl's dress like proof of why they didn't belong. And this establishment, she said icily, is not a daycare. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The violinist's bow hesitated mid-note. Somewhere near the front a fork clinked against a plate, the sound echoing too loud in the heavy quiet. The trio of young executives at the next table exchanged smirks, whispering something to each other that made one of them chuckle under his breath. Ella's chin began to tremble, Sam's jaw tightened, but he didn't yell, he didn't curse. Instead, he knelt down beside her, his movements slow and gentle. He picked up a clean napkin, dabbed it against the stain, his voice calm enough to steady her breathing. Hey, he murmured softly, it's just a stain. We've been through worse, haven't we? Ella nodded, eyes glistening. But it's ruined. He smiled faintly. Clothes don't ruin people, sweetheart. They just remind you that you've lived. It was such a quiet thing to say, but it carried weight. Enough that a few nearby diners looked down at their plates, embarrassed for having stared too long. Madeline, however, only stiffened further. If you don't leave, she said coldly, I'll have security escort you. Sam looked up at her. His expression didn't shift. No anger, no pleading, just a steady calm that unsettled her more than outrage ever could. That won't be necessary, he said quietly. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The room tensed. Even the smirking executives straightened in their seats, uncertain. The busboy, still hovering by the kitchen doors, froze where he stood. Sam pulled out his worn leather wallet, edges frayed, corners soft from years of use. He opened it, not to pull out cash or cards, but something small, round and golden, a medal. He set it gently on the table, the engraved side glinting under the chandelier light. The room went completely still. No one spoke, no one moved. The medal caught every flicker of gold in the room, its edges dull, its history carved deep. A service medal worn smooth by time, engraved with a name and 2 words beneath it, for valor. Sam didn't explain. He didn't need to. He just looked up at Madeline, his voice as steady as his hands. You can't embarrass someone who's already lost everything that ever mattered, he said, and you can't throw out a man who's fought for the right to sit wherever his daughter feels safe. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Madeline opened her mouth, but no sound came. The executives looked away. The violinist lowered his bow, and as Sam rose to his feet, the medal still gleaming quietly between them, it wasn't anger or defiance that filled the room. It was respect, the kind that demands nothing and changes everything. The restaurant seemed to exhale and fall silent, as if the room itself knew it had gone too far. Every eye was fixed on the man standing quietly at the table near the kitchen, his hand slipping into the pocket of his worn jacket, the fabric creasing like old leather. Sam Carter didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention. He simply reached for his wallet. It was the kind of wallet that told its own story, edges frayed, spine cracked, the faint smell of sawdust and oil still clinging to it. He opened it slowly, the way someone opens something sacred. Inside wasn't the glossy flash of credit cards or the smooth glint of platinum membership perks. Instead, there were creased photographs, yellowed receipts, and a child's drawing folded neatly between them, a stick-figure family holding hands under a crooked sun. Beneath it all, something caught the light. He drew it out and set it gently on the linen. A small gold medal, its surface dulled by time and fingerprints. The engraving caught the chandelier's glow. For valor. A quiet gasp came from the nearest table, the sound breaking like glass in a still room, Someone murmured, "He's a soldier." Madeline's face shifted, her confidence faltering for the first time all evening. "You're a veteran?" she asked, her voice caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to shame. Sam nodded once. 20 years, he said softly. Construction worker now. And a father. He paused, eyes steady on hers. Both jobs don't come with applause. No one spoke. Even the violinist's bow stilled mid-air. In the corner, Julian the waiter stood frozen, his tray tilted slightly, as if any motion would break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Sam reached back into his wallet, fingers moving with quiet certainty. He pulled out a small checkbook, the kind hardly anyone used anymore. The paper rasped softly as he tore a page from it. His handwriting was firm, deliberate, every stroke steady, without flourish. When he finished, he folded it once and laid it beside the metal. "For the meal," he said, his tone calm, but carrying enough weight to fill the entire restaurant. Then, glancing briefly at the crowd that had been watching him like a spectacle, he added, "And for everyone else's silence." Julian approached cautiously, his eyes flicking from Sam to the check. He picked it up and froze. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. It was a check for $1,000. The realization rippled through the tables like a wave, soft murmurs, a stifled exhale. Madeline's perfectly composed posture seemed to collapse just slightly, her polished confidence cracking in the face of something she couldn't buy or control. Sam didn't wait for her to respond. He turned back to Ella, who was sitting quietly, her small hands folded in her lap. Her eyes shimmered, reflecting the candlelight. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" he asked gently. She nodded, her voice a whisper. "Yeah, Daddy." He reached for her coat, helping her slip it on with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words he could have said. Together they began walking toward the door. Each step echoed softly across the marble floor, cutting through the thick, stunned silence. No one dared to move. Even the piano player, who had been idly pressing keys before, lowered his hands and let the quiet take over. The chandeliers glowed like frozen stars. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Sam didn't look back. He didn't need to. He opened the door, the night air spilling in, cold and clean and honest. For a moment the faintest smile crossed his face. Not pride, not triumph. Just the calm satisfaction of a man who had finally stood tall in a world that liked to make people like him small. As the door closed behind them, the spell lingered. The servers stared at the metal still glinting under the candlelight. The same executives who'd laughed earlier now stared into their untouched glasses. And Madeline Rivers, perfect, polished, untouchable, stood frozen, the words she'd spoken earlier echoing in her mind, tasting suddenly bitter. Outside, Sam took Ella's hand. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, looking up at him with eyes full of pride. "You didn't get mad," she said. "You just showed them." He smiled faintly. "Some lessons don't need shouting." They walked off into the quiet city night, their breath rising in little clouds that disappeared into the air, and behind them, Le Ventier, the restaurant that measured people by appearance and price, stayed utterly still, haunted not by shame or scandal, but by the silence left in the wake of dignity. The door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. The sound lingered, final and fragile, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Madeline Rivers stood motionless near the podium, her reflection ghosted in the glass wall beside her. For once, she didn't look like the woman she'd built herself to be. The posture was still there, shoulders square, chin lifted, but something in her eyes had shifted. She stared at the table in the far corner, the one she'd tried so hard to hide from view, now empty. Except for the faint imprint of where they'd been. The linen still held the faint crease from his wallet. The metal, his metal, glinted faintly in the flicker of the nearest candle, casting small golden reflections that shimmered across the untouched silverware. Next to it sat the check Julian hadn't dared to move, Julian approached slowly, uncertain whether to speak. His voice was a whisper. He overpaid by hundreds. Madeline's eyes didn't leave the metal. "Let him go," she said softly. "But let him go." Her voice broke slightly on the second word, and that was enough for Julian to stop. He nodded once and stepped back, retreating into the quiet, like everyone else had. The restaurant had become unnaturally still. Conversations had faded, replaced by the low hum of shame and disbelief. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim. Madeline stood there for another long moment before walking toward the table, her heels barely making a sound on the marble floor. She stopped at the edge, her hands hovering above the metal, uncertain if she had the right to touch it. The engraving caught the candlelight again, for valor, simple, eternal, the kind of honor that didn't need validation from anyone. She sank slowly into the chair he'd been sitting in, her hands folding in her lap. The seat was still warm. On the other side of the table where Ella had been, something small and colorful caught her eye, a crayon drawing left behind on the corner of the placemat. Madeline lifted it carefully. The paper was smudged at the edges, a few dots of soup marking its surface, but the drawing itself was clear. A man, a woman, and a little girl standing beneath a sky full of uneven stars. The figures were holding hands. At the bottom, written in careful, childish letters, were the words, "Mom's dream came true." The breath caught in Madeline's throat. She set the paper down, but her eyes didn't move from it. It wasn't the drawing itself that undid her, it was what it represented. A family that had fought for every bit of joy it could find, a man who had carried loss without letting it turn to bitterness, a little girl who believed in dreams so fiercely she could make the room glow just by sitting in it. Madeline pressed her fingers to her temples. For the first time in years, she felt small. Not small in the way that came from failure or humiliation, but from seeing herself clearly and realizing how long she'd been blind. She had spent her entire career curating perfection, linen without wrinkles, wine without flaws, clientele without inconvenience. She'd believed luxury was synonymous with worth, that appearances were everything, and grace came with a reservation. But that man, with his scuffed boots and quiet dignity, had just dismantled everything she thought she understood in a single gesture. She looked again at the metal. The candlelight shimmered across its surface, and she felt something twist deep in her chest, a sharp, unfamiliar guilt that wouldn't go down no matter how hard she tried to swallow it. Luxury, she realized, had blinded her. The pursuit of polish had stripped her of sight. She'd forgotten what grace looked like when it didn't wear designer shoes or speak in softened tones. She'd forgotten what humility sounded like when it wasn't rehearsed. A soft laugh escaped her, bitter and small. "You just wanted dinner," she whispered to no one. Her eyes fell back on the crayon drawing. The stars seemed to glow brighter now under the flickering light, and she imagined that somewhere outside, that little girl was walking beneath the real ones, hand in hand with the man who refused to bow his head. Madeline sat there for a long time, the sounds of the restaurant slowly returning around her, but none of them reached her. She had built her life on appearances, but tonight, for the first time, she understood that true elegance had never been about the chandeliers or the silver. It had walked right out her door with a janitor and his daughter. By the next morning, the world knew, somewhere between the clinking of wine glasses and the silence that followed Sam Carter's quiet act of defiance, someone had pressed record. The footage wasn't long, barely 2 minutes, but it was enough. It showed everything that words couldn't. The way the metal caught the light, the hush that fell over the restaurant, the stillness of a man who had no need to shout to be heard. When the video hit the internet, it spread like spilled ink. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Headlines bloomed across news feeds and social platforms like "Wildfire, Veteran Humiliated at Upscale Restaurant." "Single Father Teaches Priceless Lesson in Dignity. The Moment a Room Remembered Its Humanity." In each upload, the comments flooded in. Some cried, some raged, some saw themselves in him. By the time Madeline Rivers unlocked her phone, it was vibrating with notifications. Her inbox overflowed with messages, some sympathetic, many not. There were calls from reporters, colleagues, old friends she hadn't spoken to in years, all asking the same thing. Was it true? But the message that mattered most came from one name, Alden. Mr. Charles Alden, the owner of Levantier, a man known for his temper as much as his money. His text was short, simple, and terrifying. "Come in, now." When she arrived, the restaurant felt different, haunted by its own reputation. The once proud, glittering foyer now seemed cold, the marble echoing with footsteps that used to impress her, but now sounded hollow. The staff avoided her eyes. Julian didn't even say hello. He just gave a small, wary nod and disappeared into the kitchen. Alden was waiting for her in his office upstairs, his sleeves rolled, his expression sharp enough to cut through glass. "Explain yourself," he demanded, before she could even close the door. Madeline tried to find words that could somehow shrink the damage, words that could make her look like the professional she'd spent her life pretending to be. "It wasn't intentional," she began. "He came in, he didn't look like he belonged," Alden snapped. His voice carried the same authority that had built empires and broken egos. "You thought you were protecting the image of this restaurant, didn't you?" "You were protecting yourself." Her chest tightened. "I misjudged him," she said quietly. Alden leaned back in his chair, staring at her for a long, cold moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "You misjudged humanity. Fix it." She opened her mouth, but nothing came. How do you fix something like that? A single moment, a single cruel sentence that had unraveled her entire facade. She left his office without another word. Outside, the staff parted around her like she was contagious. She went home, but rest never came. All night, the video played on her screen, over and over, each replay stripping away another layer of the armor she'd built around herself. She watched him again, the way he stood, the way he placed that medal on the table with such quiet reverence. He hadn't tried to make a point. He'd simply been won. She watched his daughter, too, her small face glowing with pride, even in the silence. When the little girl looked up at her father, it wasn't with surprise. It was recognition. She had always known who he was, even if no one else did. Madeline's hand trembled as she paused the video. The word "earned" echoed in her mind, the one he'd said so simply, so firmly the night before. She'd spent years chasing applause, approval, prestige, things that could be bought, managed, controlled. But that man, with his dusty boots and soft voice, had something she'd never been able to earn: respect. By dawn, she was still sitting there, the gray light creeping across her living room, her phone still buzzing with alerts. The video had surpassed 1 million views. Levantier's page was flooded with outrage, apologies demanded in every language. Madeline didn't respond to any of it. She didn't write a statement, didn't call the PR team, didn't try to salvage her image. She just sat there in silence, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes, whispering the only truth that finally made sense. "I misjudged humanity," she said to the empty room, "and he reminded me what it looks like." Then she hit replay, one more time, not to analyze, not to defend, but to remember. And somewhere between his calm and his daughter's quiet pride, something inside her broke open, not in weakness, but in something dangerously close to humility. The knock came just after sunrise, soft but deliberate, the kind that doesn't belong to neighbors or salesmen. Sam was still in his work clothes from the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold. The world outside was barely waking, the hum of early traffic, the distant bark of a dog, the muted sigh of a city trying to forget yesterday. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, she was standing there, Madeline Rivers, but not the woman from the restaurant, the one wrapped in control and arrogance, draped in perfume and authority. This woman was different. No heels, no sharp lines, no armor. Her hair was tied loosely, her face bare, her eyes tired but clear. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of everything that once made her intimidating. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I came to say I'm sorry." Sam didn't answer right away. He just stood there, the morning light falling across his face. Behind him, the faint sound of a cartoon played from the old TV, Ella's favorite morning show. He could feel her presence even before she peeked out from behind his leg, curious, cautious. Madeline's eyes softened when she saw the little girl. "Hi, Ella," she said gently. Ella didn't reply, only clutched the edge of her father's shirt. Sam looked at Madeline, his expression unreadable. "You embarrassed us," he said finally, not with anger, but with truth. Madeline nodded. "I know," she said, "and I deserve every ounce of it." She hesitated, then continued, her voice quieter now. "But your daughter, she reminded me what kindness looks like." "I haven't seen that in a long time." Sam's jaw flexed slightly, but he didn't speak. There were no words that could make sense of what had happened, no apology that could erase the image of his daughter wiping a red stain off her dress while strangers laughed. Madeline reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, holding it carefully, like she wasn't sure she had the right to hand it to him. "This isn't money," she said quickly. "I'm not here to buy forgiveness." Sam hesitated before taking it. The envelope was simple, cream-colored, no logo, no pretense. He opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The words were typed neatly, but it was the signature that caught his eye. Charles Alden, owner of Levantier. The letter was brief but sincere. It was an apology, not from lawyers, not from PR, but from a man who had watched the same viral video the rest of the world had seen. It spoke of regret, of recognition, of responsibility. And then came the last paragraph, the one that made Sam stop reading aloud. The restaurant would host a public dinner for veterans and their families. No dress code, no price tags, no barriers, everything paid for by Levantier. A night of gratitude, a night to make things right. Sam stood there in silence, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. "I pushed for it," Madeline said quietly. "It's the least we can do. I can't undo what I did to you, or your little girl, but maybe this can mean something. Maybe we can start again." Sam looked at her for a long moment, studying her face. She wasn't performing. There was no practiced remorse, no PR spin. Just a woman standing in the morning light, trying to make peace with her own reflection. Behind him, Ella tugged gently at his sleeve. "What's it say, Daddy?" He crouched down to her level, showing her the letter. "They want to say sorry, sweetheart," he said. "They're inviting us to dinner." Ella's eyes widened. "At the same place?" "The very same," he said. She thought about it for a moment, her small fingers tracing the edge of the paper. Then she smiled. A real, bright, unguarded smile. "Maybe Mom would want us to go," she said softly. Sam's chest tightened, that familiar ache rising and falling like a tide. He looked back at Madeline, who was standing quietly, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she deserved. He nodded once. "All right," he said finally. "We'll come." For the first time since he'd met her, Madeline smiled, not the polite professional kind, but something fragile, grateful, human. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." As she turned to leave, the morning sun broke fully through the clouds, spilling light across the hallway. Ella waved shyly after her, and for a moment it didn't feel like closure or forgiveness. It felt like a beginning. Sam looked down at the letter again, at the words, "A night of gratitude," and thought maybe this time it really could be. A week later, Levantier didn't look like Levantier anymore. The chandeliers still shimmered like constellations, the marble still gleamed under soft golden light, but something unseen had changed. The air felt different, lighter, warmer. The quiet exclusivity that used to hover in the corners was gone, replaced by laughter, by the sound of children running between tables, by the echo of stories that didn't need to be polished to be worth hearing. The velvet ropes had been taken down. The reservation required signs were gone. For the first time in its history, the restaurant's doors stood open to everyone. Veterans in crisp uniforms and worn boots, families in Sunday clothes and borrowed dresses, faces from every corner of the city. There was no pretense, no dress code, no one glancing at shoes before offering a seat. Every table was full. Every soul felt seen. Madeline Rivers stood at the front entrance, no longer the immovable gatekeeper of fine dining, but a host in the truest sense of the word. She greeted each guest personally, handshakes, hugs, even laughter that reached her eyes. The staff watched her with quiet astonishment, unsure if they'd ever seen her smile like that. When Sam and Ella arrived, a ripple moved through the crowd. The murmurs quieted, just for a moment, as if everyone knew the story that had brought them here. Madeline turned, spotting them in the doorway. Her eyes shimmered, but this time not from shame. "Welcome back," she said softly, stepping forward. Sam smiled faintly, adjusting his jacket. "Didn't think I'd see this place again," he said. "You helped change it," she replied, her voice thick with sincerity. He looked around, the tables filled with veterans laughing together, a little girl twirling between chairs, an elderly couple clinking glasses like newlyweds. "No," he said quietly, "you did. You just needed to remember who you were before the suits." For a moment the two of them stood there in understanding, surrounded by everything that had gone wrong and somehow come right again. Ella tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "they're playing Mom's song." The violinist in the corner had started to play a slow, gentle melody, Claire de Lune, Mary Ann's favorite. The notes drifted through the room like a soft wind, and Sam closed his eyes for half a second, feeling her there not as pain but as presence. Dinner unfolded like a celebration disguised as simplicity. Long tables replaced the small, exclusive ones. Dishes came out family style, shared between strangers who didn't stay strangers for long. Conversations bloomed, stories of service, loss, survival, and hope. Julian, now promoted to head server, moved gracefully through the room, his smile genuine, his movements unhurried. The busboy who had spilled the wine was there too, laughing with Ella as he brought her a glass of lemonade on the house. No one looked at him with disdain anymore. At the end of the night, Mr. Alden himself stepped forward, taking the small stage near the piano. The room quieted as he raised his glass. "Tonight," he said, "we honor not only the brave men and women who serve this country, but the courage it takes to see people, truly see them. Levantier is not the same place it was a week ago, and for that we have one man and his daughter to thank." All eyes turned toward Sam and Ella. Sam tried to shake his head, tried to deflect, but applause had already begun. It started with one table, then another, and then the entire restaurant was on its feet. The sound was thunderous, alive, and full of something deeper than gratitude. The applause wasn't just for soldiers. It wasn't even for Sam. It was for the idea that kindness still had a place in a world that often forgot it. It was for the woman who'd swallowed her pride to make amends. It was for the little girl who believed that promises should be kept, even when life made them impossible. It was for redemption. As the ovation swelled, Sam looked down at Ella, who clapped with both hands, her smile brighter than the chandeliers above. He leaned close and whispered, "Your mom would have loved this." Ella nodded, eyes glowing. "She's here, Daddy," she said simply. And for once, Sam didn't question it. He believed her. When the last note from the violin faded and the applause finally died down, Madeline caught his eye across the room. She mouthed two words, small but full of meaning. "Thank you." Sam smiled back, tipping his head in quiet acknowledgement. Outside, the city lights flickered like candles, and for one rare night, an upscale restaurant in Manhattan had turned into something more, a place where humility dined beside grace. where people remembered that decency never needed a dress code. The dinner had ended hours ago, but Levantier still glowed with the kind of warmth no lighting fixture could create. The guests had long filtered out into the cool night, leaving behind echoes of laughter, a few forgotten napkins, and the lingering scent of vanilla and wine. Staff moved quietly through the space, stacking chairs, clearing glasses, their motions unhurried and gentle, like no one wanted the night to end just yet. Sam lingered by the bar. The last guest left. The polished counter reflected the golden light above him, and for once he didn't feel out of place there. Julian wiped down the counter beside him, sleeves rolled up, the faintest grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. The young man had been watching him all evening, not with pity, but admiration. "You ever think kindness costs too much?" Sam asked, breaking the comfortable silence. His tone was casual, but the question carried more weight than he let on. Julian paused, resting the rag over his shoulder. "Maybe," he said after a moment, "but I think cruelty costs more." Sam smiled faintly, nodding. "You're right about that." They stood there quietly for a while, the faint hum of the dishwasher filling the space between words. For the first time in years, Sam didn't feel like he was waiting for something to go wrong. He wasn't fighting against the world tonight. He was just part of it. Across the room, Ella sat at a table near the window, legs swinging, a box of crayons spread out in front of her. The little girl had been drawing since dessert ended, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth as she worked. A half-empty glass of lemonade sat beside her, tiny droplets of condensation trailing down its side. Madeline stood a few feet away, watching her. The other staff were cleaning up, laughing quietly among themselves, but Madeline didn't move. Her heels were off, her posture relaxed for once. The sternness that used to define her was gone, replaced by something softer, something real. When Ella looked up and saw her, she smiled, that easy, guileless kind of smile that could disarm even the coldest heart. "I'm almost done," she said, holding the drawing steady with one hand. Madeline walked over and crouched beside her. "Can I see?" she asked gently. Ella nodded, spinning the paper around with both hands. The picture was of Levantier, the restaurant, the same grand chandeliers and curved tables, but brighter. The walls were bursting with color. The people inside weren't stiff or proper. They were smiling, laughing, leaning across tables. At the center was a small figure behind a podium, drawn in bright blue crayon. "That's you?" Ella said matter-of-factly. Madeline blinked. "Me?" Ella nodded again. "You look happier this time." Madeline's throat tightened. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. Ella tilted her head. "You can have it," she said simply, "so you don't forget again." Madeline froze, the words sinking deep into the quiet between them. "So you don't forget again." She reached out, taking the drawing carefully, as though it were made of glass. For a long moment she just stared at it, at the bright colors, at the little girl's faith that people could change and stay changed. "I won't," Madeline said finally. "I promise." Ella smiled, satisfied. "Good. Because it's really hard to draw chandeliers," she added, making Madeline laugh through the ache in her throat. Later that night, long after the last chair had been stacked and the lights had dimmed, Madeline returned to her office. She set her purse down, kicked off her shoes, and looked at the walls that once held nothing but schedules, financial reports, and glossy certificates of achievement. They suddenly looked meaningless. She unfolded Ella's drawing and smoothed it out with both hands. The paper was creased and a little sticky at the corner where lemonade had spilled, but it was perfect. Without thinking twice, she reached up and pinned it to the wall above her mirror. The paper hung slightly crooked, but she didn't fix it. It didn't need to be perfect. For a long time she just stood there, staring at it. The bright crayons, the smiling faces, the reminder of what she'd almost forgotten. In the reflection of the mirror she caught her own eyes, and for the first time in years she saw something familiar looking back. Not control, not vanity, not fear, just humility. just gratitude. Madeline smiled softly. "Don't forget again," she whispered. And in the quiet glow of her office, with Ella's drawing watching over her, she knew she wouldn't. The months that followed moved quietly, like the slow rhythm of a song still echoing after the final note. The story that had once set the city ablaze, the viral video, the dinner, the redemption, gradually slipped from the headlines. People moved on, as they always did. But something lingered. Not fame, not scandal, just a faint memory of kindness that refused to disappear completely. For Sam Carter, life returned to its steady, familiar pace. He was back on job sites before sunrise, steel-toed boots laced tight, hands rough and steady as he worked. The clang of hammers, the smell of sawdust, the ache in his shoulders, all of it was grounding. He didn't crave the attention that had briefly found him. In truth, he was almost relieved to fade back into normalcy. Ella, though, had changed in small, beautiful ways. She was taller now, braver, her laughter louder and more frequent. Her drawings had grown more detailed, people and places with light pouring out of them, as though she'd started seeing the world not for what it was, but for what it could be. She still carried her crayons everywhere, tucked into a tin lunchbox that had once held her mother's recipes. Every now and then someone would stop them on the street. A stranger, hesitant at first, eyes widening with recognition. "You're the restaurant guy, aren't you?" they'd say. The veteran. The video. Sam would smile politely, shaking his head. "Just a dad trying to keep a promise," he'd reply, his voice gentle. Then they'd move on, and the moment would fade. But Ella always noticed the way people looked at him afterward, with warmth, with something like quiet respect. It made her proud. The winter thawed into spring, and the days began to stretch longer. One afternoon, Sam came home to find an envelope waiting on the kitchen table. Thick paper, embossed edges, his name written neatly across the front. It wasn't a bill, and it wasn't junk mail. The handwriting was too deliberate for that. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a single page, the scent of lavender faint on the paper. "We're opening a second location," the letter read. "Not a copy of Levantier, but something new, a place that feels like belonging. And I can't think of anyone better to help us design it than the man who reminded us what that word really means." At the bottom, signed in looping ink, was a single name, Madeline Rivers. Sam stared at the letter for a long time, unsure what to make of it. The words were simple, but they carried weight, gratitude, humility, something almost reverent. "Me?" he muttered aloud, reading it again as if it might change. "She wants me to help design a restaurant?" From across the table, Ella looked up from her sketchbook, her face brightening instantly. "You're famous, Daddy," she said, bouncing in her chair. He laughed, shaking his head. "No, sweetheart. Famous people make headlines. We just reminded people how to be human." Ella leaned forward, eyes wide with wonder. "But isn't that even better?" He paused, then smiled softly. "Yeah," he admitted, "it is." He looked down at the letter again, tracing the words with his calloused fingers. "A place that feels like belonging," he whispered. The phrase hit something deep inside him, a memory maybe, or just the echo of that night when belonging had felt like something impossible. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint scratch of Ella's crayon against paper. When she held up her drawing a few minutes later, Sam looked over and saw what she'd made. It was a building, not grand, not ornate, but filled with light. The sign over the door read "Home." He smiled, tucking the letter carefully into the back of his wallet behind the worn photograph of Marianne and Ella. Maybe, he thought, it was time to build something new, not from concrete and beams, but from the kind of strength that lasts longer than stone. And somewhere he could almost hear his wife's voice again, soft and teasing. "See? Real napkins, after all." Sam chuckled under his breath, the ache in his chest warm this time. "Yeah," he murmured, "real napkins. And real people. Outside, the evening sun dipped low, spilling gold through the kitchen window, and for the first time in a long time, Sam Carter didn't just feel like he was surviving. He felt like he was being called home. The summer air carried the smell of sawdust and new beginnings. Hammers echoed against wooden beams, drills hummed like bees, and sunlight poured through the open framework of what would soon become Mary Ann's. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. There would be no chandeliers, no marble floors, no maitre d' guarding the door like a gatekeeper of worth. This place was built for warmth, not status. Sam stood near the front window, blueprints rolled under one arm, watching as a group of workers sanded down the last of the wooden tables. He'd chosen them himself, oak, simple, strong, and handmade, tables that could survive laughter, spilled soup, and time. Ella sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, sketchbook open, pencil smudging her fingertips. She'd insisted on helping design parts of the place, and Sam had long since learned that her ideas carried more heart than most professionals. "Make sure the windows are low," she said, not looking up, "so kids can see the stars." Sam smiled. "The stars, huh?" "Yeah," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Mom said stars remind people they're never really alone, even if they think they are." He swallowed hard, his chest tightening for a moment. "Then low windows it is." She grinned and went back to drawing. Across the construction site, Madeline was talking with one of the electricians, clipboard in hand. The woman who once commanded rooms with clipped tones and cold precision now wore rolled-up sleeves and sneakers, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. The transformation wasn't loud. It was steady, honest, the kind that came from truly learning, not pretending to. She walked over, brushing sawdust from her jeans. "You know," she said, looking around the half-finished space, "this feels more like a home than a restaurant." "That's the idea," Sam replied. Madeline rested her hands on her hips, watching a painter coat the walls in soft cream. "You ever think life gives second chances?" Sam's gaze drifted toward Ella, who was now helping a worker hang string lights over the doorway. "Only if you earn them," he said quietly. "And even then, it's less about getting another chance and more about not wasting it." She nodded slowly, her eyes misting. "I think you just described my entire life," she murmured. They stood in companionable silence for a while, listening to the rhythm of tools and footsteps, the melody of creation. For Sam, it wasn't just a building going up. It was healing taking shape, nail by nail, beam by beam. When opening day finally came, the city felt different. Maybe it was the summer breeze, or maybe it was the quiet hope that seemed to follow this place wherever it went. The sign above the door was modest, hand-carved and painted by one of the local veterans who'd volunteered during construction. "Mary Ann's," it read in simple script. There was no red carpet at the entrance, no line of paparazzi or critics waiting to dissect it. Just people, families, neighbors, workers, children, filing in with the kind of joy that doesn't need validation. Inside, the lights glowed warm and golden. The tables were close enough for strangers to share conversation. On the walls hung art from local schools and handwritten notes from guests who'd visited Levantier's redemption dinner. One of them read, "Kindness served here." Ella ran through the door first, her braid swinging. She looked around proudly. "It's perfect," she said. Sam smiled, a softness in his eyes. "It's hers," he said. He meant Mary Ann, of course, but Madeline understood. It was for all of them, for anyone who had ever been turned away, unseen, unheard. That evening, as the first customers settled in, the air filled with the hum of conversation and laughter. Sam walked through the room quietly, greeting people, straightening a napkin here, refilling a glass there. He didn't need applause or recognition, just the sight of full tables, of people who finally felt they belonged. From the counter, Madeline watched him and said to herself, "This is what grace looks like." When the night came to a close, Sam stepped outside, wiping his hands on his apron. The sign above him glowed softly in the dusk. "Mary Ann's," he whispered, looking up at the stars through the low windows his daughter had requested. And for the first time in years, he felt it completely, the peace that comes when love, loss, and purpose finally learn how to coexist. Mary Ann's didn't just open, it bloomed. What began as a small restaurant on a quiet street corner became something the city didn't realize it had been missing. It wasn't the food that made it famous, though the food was good, comforting, simple, honest. What made it remarkable was the heart that filled the space. The walls seemed to hum with warmth, the kind that can't be faked or franchised. People came not to be impressed, but to belong. Within months, Mary Ann's had become more than a restaurant. It was a refuge, a place where the lonely found company, where families without much found more than they expected. Every first Sunday of the month, the doors opened wide for anyone who needed a meal. No questions, no forms, no judgment. The sign outside read, in soft gold letters, "Come as you are, leave a little lighter." Madeline ran operations, though she no longer looked like a woman running anything. She moved through the restaurant without the edge she once carried, laughing with the staff, hugging guests like old friends. She was softer now, still sharp when she needed to be, but grounded, rooted in gratitude instead of image. She often said this place saved her as much as it did anyone else. Sam handled logistics, though the word felt too small for what he did. He fixed leaks, managed schedules, arranged deliveries, and somehow always found time to sit down with anyone who needed to talk. He knew the names of every dishwasher, every server, every regular who came through the door. To them, he wasn't the owner. He was the anchor. And then there was Ella. She didn't work there, not officially, but she might as well have. On busy nights, she darted between tables, handing out crayons and paper to children, while her laughter danced through the air. Her drawings now hung framed across the walls. Bright skies, tables full of people, and a little sign above the door that read, "Mom's dream came true." One afternoon, a journalist from the local paper came by, notebook in hand. She'd heard about the place that had quietly changed a city. After sampling the food and watching the crowd, she sat across from Sam near the window. "Why call it Mary Ann's?" she asked, pen poised, ready to record something clever. Sam leaned back in his chair, looking around the room, the crowded tables, the smiling faces, the low hum of conversation that sounded more like music than noise. Then his eyes landed on the sign above the door, the one Ella had helped paint. "Because every dream deserves a seat at the table," he said simply. The journalist wrote it down, but even she looked up and smiled. Some words didn't need embellishment. Years went by and the restaurant never stopped growing, not in size, but in spirit. People from every background, every corner of the city, found their way to Mary Ann's. Some came for the food, some for the peace it offered, and some because they'd heard the story of the man who once stood his ground in a place that tried to make him feel small. Sam still worked there every day, his hands calloused but steady, his heart quiet but full. And sometimes, between the rush of dinner service or the soft lull of closing time, he would look toward the corner table, the same kind of table where his story had once begun. Every so often he'd see a little girl sitting with her father. Sometimes she wore a white dress, sometimes she was coloring on a napkin, but the scene was always the same. She'd lean close and whisper, "This was Mom's dream." And every time Sam would smile to himself, the corners of his mouth curving in that slow, private way he'd learned from years of learning what really mattered. He never interrupted, never approached. He just let it be, because history had repeated itself, but this time it healed. Outside, the city glowed in the evening light, and inside, Mary Ann's continued to hum softly with life. It wasn't a restaurant for the rich, or the powerful, or the polished. It was a place for the human, for the tired, the hopeful, the broken, and the brave. And for as long as the lights of Mary Ann's burned warm in its windows, the dream that began with one small promise, made long ago in love, and kept through grace, would never fade. The years had moved quietly, not fast or slow, just steady, the way time often moves when a person has made peace with it. Mary Ann's had grown into a place that seemed to exist beyond the calendar, untouched by the rush of the city outside. Its walls were lined with stories now, photos of guests who had once come hungry and left hopeful, newspaper clippings about its origins, and drawings from children who had eaten there and insisted on leaving a piece of themselves behind. Ella was one of them once. Now she was nearly grown, standing taller than the counter where she used to color, her hair longer, her laughter softer. The world had begun calling her forward, whispering promises of her own adventures. She was packing for college the night she asked him. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" she said, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, a stack of books beside her. Sam looked at her, the lamplight spilling across her face, so much like Mary Ann's. "She already is," he said, smiling. Ella didn't answer right away, just nodded, tracing the edge of one of her notebooks. "I still feel her sometimes," she said quietly, "especially at the restaurant." He nodded. "That's because she's still there. Some people don't leave, they just change shape." She smiled faintly, like music you can't stop hearing. He liked that. It sounded like something Mary Ann would have said. Later that week, on a slow Sunday evening, they decided to close the restaurant early. The sign on the door read, "Private Event." There was no real event, just the two of them, a father and daughter sitting down for what Sam called the last reservation. The staff had all gone home, except Madeline, who stayed behind to help. She had aged gracefully, time softening her sharp edges into something elegant but genuine. When she entered the dining room, she carried a small bouquet of lilies, the kind Mary Ann loved. "For the table," she said, setting them down gently beside the flickering candle. To promises kept, Sam raised his glass of wine, and for a moment his voice caught in his throat. "To second chances," he said finally. They clinked glasses softly, the sound small but complete. Madeline lingered for a moment, smiling at Ella, who now looked every bit the woman her mother had hoped she'd become. "You're off to big things," she said warmly. Ella grinned. "I'm just following what you and Dad built." Madeline reached out, squeezing her shoulder gently. "Then you'll be just fine." After she left, the restaurant settled into an easy silence. Outside, the city lights blinked like tired stars. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of roasted herbs, fresh bread, and lilies. The kind of smell that could make even an empty room feel full. They talked about everything that night. College plans, old memories, what to do with the restaurant while Ella was gone. Sam told her about the first night he met her mother, how Mary Ann had been singing softly to herself in a nearly empty piano bar, and how he knew from that very moment that she would change his life. "I didn't know how much," he said, chuckling quietly. Even after she was gone, she still kept changing it. Ella leaned her head on his shoulder. "She still is," she whispered. For a while they just sat there, the only sound the quiet hum of the lights and the soft tapping of rain beginning to fall outside. Sam didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But that night, as he looked around the room, the one Mary Ann had dreamed of, the one they'd built from heartbreak into something beautiful, he felt her there. Not as a shadow, but as warmth, in the soft flicker of candlelight, in the laughter that echoed faintly through the hall, in the peace that had finally taken root in his chest. When the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, Sam stood and looked at his daughter. "You ready, kiddo?" Ella smiled. "For what?" "For whatever comes next." She nodded, her eyes glistening but steady. As they walked out, he glanced back one last time at the table, the flowers, the soft glow of the room that had once been a dream. And somewhere between the laughter that lingered and the silence that followed, Sam Carter felt something he hadn't in years. Not sadness, not longing, just gratitude. Mary Ann wasn't gone. She was home. The story of Mary Ann's never really ended. It just kept finding new ways to live. Years after its doors first opened, someone shared an old photo online, a simple image of Sam Carter standing outside the restaurant, his hands resting on the sign, smiling in that quiet way of his. The caption read, "He built a place where everyone belongs." It went viral overnight. Not because people remembered the scandal that started it all, but because the world still craved proof that kindness could outlast chaos. Soon, stories began flooding in from every corner of the internet. People shared their own moments of grace, strangers paying for someone's meal, managers apologizing instead of firing, families rebuilding connection over dinner tables they hadn't sat at together in years. One woman wrote, "I used to work at a restaurant like Le Ventier. I watched people judged for how they looked. After I read about Marianne's, I quit. I opened my own cafe where no one has to earn a seat." Another story came from a single father in Ohio who said, "Your story reminded me that dignity isn't something others give you. It's something you carry even when they look past you." Sam never commented on the posts. He didn't like attention. He still worked at the restaurant, though he'd stopped wearing the apron years ago. Now he spent his time mentoring younger staff, fixing leaky sinks, and making sure the lilies by the windows stayed fresh. To him, fame was noise, but meaning. That was music. When reporters occasionally stopped by, hoping for quotes or photo ops, Sam would just smile politely and say, "I'm no one special." I just kept a promise. That was the thing about him. He never saw what the rest of the world did. He didn't see a symbol of quiet dignity or resilience. He saw a father who had once tried not to break in front of his daughter, and a man who got lucky enough to turn that moment into hope for someone else. Madeline had changed too. Over time, she became an unexpected voice in an industry that had once worshipped exclusivity. Invitations poured in from conferences, universities, even business summits. She stood on stages where the words profit and prestige once ruled the air, and instead she talked about something different. "Luxury means nothing without love," she told one crowd. "I spent years curating beauty and forgot that real beauty begins with humility. The man who changed me didn't have wealth or power. He had truth." Her speeches spread. Her name became synonymous with reform, and yet she never let people forget the story's real author. "It started with a janitor and a piano," she'd often say, smiling softly, "and a little girl who refused to stop believing in kindness." That little girl had grown up. Ella, now in her late 20s, stood outside her own building one spring morning, a modest brick office with large glass windows. The sign above the door read, "The Second Table Foundation." Its mission was simple but profound, to help single parents and children dine with dignity, offering meal programs and community spaces that felt like home instead of handouts. Inside, her first office smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. The walls were still bare except for one thing, a framed crayon sketch, the same one she'd made when she was 8. The colors had faded slightly, the paper curled at the corners, but the words were still there. Mom's dream came true. She'd added a second line beneath it, written in her own adult handwriting. The ink pressed deep into the page, and it changed the world. Sometimes, when the work felt heavy, when funding was slow, or the world seemed too complicated to change, Ella would look at that drawing and remember. She'd remember her father kneeling beside her in a restaurant that had once tried to make them invisible. She'd remember the night she saw him play the piano and make the world listen without a single word. And she'd remember her mother, the woman who dreamed of a dinner they never got to share, but who, in some strange and beautiful way, had built a legacy from beyond her years. One evening, after the Foundation's first successful fundraiser, Sam visited her office. He stood quietly in front of the drawing for a long time before saying anything. "She'd be proud," he said softly. Ella smiled. "She already is," she whispered, echoing his old words. He looked at her, at the reflection of the past and future intertwined in her eyes, and nodded. "Then I guess the table's still open," he said. And it was. Because Marianne's had never really been about food. It was about grace, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that invites the world to sit down and remember what being human really means.